In addition to that, we will ask that those of you who are attending here will stay on mute for most of the session. There may be some occasions during the course of the presentation where you can unmute and participate. We certainly do encourage you to participate via the chat at any point. Feel free to ask questions, or if you want to offer comments, that's welcome as well. Certainly, I think all of us are pretty tuned up on Zoom at this point, but if you have some technical issues with your video particularly, or audio actually too, feel free to remove yourself from the video portion of this and to shut that down, and perhaps that will help with some of the tech issues you're having there. So if we could have the next slide here, Brian, thank you. As I said, I am the Director of Massachusetts Programs with iCivics. I do a lot of work in leading the professional development here in the state, as well as some advocacy for improving civic education, particularly across the state. And the real heart of that work, particularly around the advocacy end of this, is the work that I do with the Massachusetts Civic Learning Coalition. So I'm here representing a coalition of about 40 organizations from across the state that came together about close to 4 years ago now to really advocate for what was then a proposed bill for improving civic learning in the state. That is now the new civics law that came to pass in 2018. And we've been very fortunate to be available and to serve as a kind of champion for civic education here in Massachusetts for a number of years, and have really succeeded quite well, not only in championing the passage of that bill, but also in ensuring that there's some continued state funding for this. And we're also working closely with some private partners as well, and have had some fortunate collaboration with those folks to make much of our work really possible. So it has been a great journey, and we're hoping to continue to grow the constituency and the base for civic education here in Massachusetts. We do have a website that you will have available to you via a link that we're providing in the chat here, which is just, I just included in the chat. We've included a resource list for today's session that includes links to some of the materials that I'll mention, as well as the resources that our presenters will be offering this afternoon. In addition on that, you'll have a link there to the Massachusetts Civic Learning Coalition, so feel free to access that. And do check out some of the resources that we have available on that site. The homepage for that resource aspect of things is shown here on this slide here. We've put that together really with an eye to serving the purposes of educators, both in the classroom and also for remote learning. And much of that is broken out by grade level so that it's designed to be as usable as possible. So we hope that helps your work if you're in the classroom, and perhaps if you're not, it will also help with some of the work that you have underway around civic education as well. So much of our work, particularly with regard to our focus, both in our work in advocacy as well as the focus of these webinars, is driven by a report that came out just last January, just a year ago. It was created in a collaboration between CIRCLE, that's the Center for Information and Research on Civic Learning and Engagement at Tufts, as well as a group at Boston University and the Massachusetts Department of Elementary and Secondary Education. And that report was really a survey of the state of civic education here in Massachusetts. And some of the key recommendations that came out of that are listed here on the slide here. And just as a couple of highlights from that, some of the findings from that were really that we need to focus more particularly on the needs of high needs districts, and to make sure that there is true equity in the provision of civic education across the state. So it's our hope in presentations like today's, for example, that we are helping to address that in not only providing the resources for those districts, but also for providing curriculum that can support the needs and the cultural diversity of all students in all of our districts across the state. In addition, there's a focus particularly on supporting elementary teachers, and also filling some of the gaps in both in the knowledge base and the strong pedagogy practices both in the middle school and the high school grades. We're also really thinking this year particularly about supporting administrators, given that that's also a need. Many administrators, quite rightly, haven't had the support for many, many years around civic education. There's been certainly much neglect of civic education for many years, so it's not surprising that that's the case. But we're trying to shore up that support for administrators particularly, and hope that today's session, as well as some of the others that we'll be offering this year, will do that as well. So I think you'll see some of the aspects of these focus areas in the presentation today. We're really fortunate particularly to have Eamon with us as well, as a former student from North Andover Public Schools, to be offering some of his perspective as a previous student in the K-12 system here. So today's session, I'm going to pass the baton here in just a minute to our presenters. So the focus of our presentation will be about 45 minutes. At the end, we will have time for question and answer, some discussion. And again, we'll hope that's a time when we can make it more interactive for all of you as well. Feel free to, again, if you didn't get the message earlier, to include your comments and questions in the chat. We'll be monitoring that. And we'll come back to those questions at the very end in that Q&A session there. So just by way of introduction here, I just want to make a note here about the fact that, for many years in this field, it was sort of traditionally thought of that we had sort of a unified single history of our country. And I think one of the exciting things about teaching in this field and about being involved in history and social studies in general is the fact that we're open, we're flexible, and we're open to new ideas and to evolving our understanding of history. We wouldn't be very good historians if we didn't do that in the first place. And I think our thinking has really evolved in some fairly recent years around this understanding that we really have many histories, that it's not just a single history, and that's really important, particularly in terms of making sure that we provide a more inclusive curriculum for students, that we're providing material that's particularly engaging for students, and that we really, all of us, gain a deeper understanding of the history of our country. And I think if we think about just what's happening tomorrow, the anniversary of January 6th, 2021, that event, particularly the insurrection in Washington, D.C., is particularly a lesson for all of us, I think, about the importance of having that deeper understanding of our history. And I just really want to appreciate the work of Beth Berenger, Brian Sheehy, and Eamon Osirial from North Andover High School in their work and their courage, particularly to rethink the way we teach history and to think about how the curriculum, particularly in North Andover Public Schools, but in other districts as well, can be reorganized to better address this more inclusive and this need for deeper understanding of our history. So I'm going to turn it over here to Beth to introduce yourself, if you would, and then the other members of the presenting team here this afternoon to introduce themselves, and we'll get started with our presentation. Thanks for being here, Beth.
Thank you so much, Dave. Thank you so much for that introduction. I really appreciate what you just said about, evolving ideas of how we want to approach history, and that's what we'll be discussing today with this program that we put together. My name is Beth Berenger, and I'm the Director of Education Programs at a nonprofit called Essex Heritage, and we're actually a regional nonprofit that helps to connect people with the really amazing historic, cultural, and natural resource-based organizations and sites and assets in Essex County in the northeastern part of the state. And I love my job there. But before that, I did teach in the public schools at Gloucester High School for a while, and really happy to be with you here today. Brian?
Hi, everybody. Brian Sheehy. I'm the History Department Coordinator at North Andover High. Just really happy to talk about this program. It's kind of become a labor of love in putting this together. And as you'll hear through this presentation, it was really student driven in kind of making a change in being more inclusive and having difficult discussions. And so this whole process and professional development program really stemmed from students. And I'm going to kick it over to my former student, Eamon.
Yes, hi. So I'm Eamon. I'm a former North Andover High School student, and while I was there, I was fortunate enough to work with Mr. Sheehy, along with many of my peers, to push for this civic engagement and this greater role of students in taking back their education, so that we could have a more diverse curriculum and an education that looked more like what we wanted to see. So I'm very happy to talk about that today.
Perfect.
Great. So as we were mentioning, this program, which we call Teaching Hidden Histories, that we're going to be discussing today, was actually a professional development series of online workshops that we put together during COVID, during a really difficult time for teachers. But as you just heard from Eamon and Brian, it really did stem from an identified need in the community. So I think it really does align so well with some of the civic ideals that we're, probably focusing on in this series, where we want to be addressing issues that are coming up that are emerging from our community. And this program was responding to one of those issues. What we did was we tried to put together some workshops to collaboratively help sort of support each other as educators in approaching histories of traditionally marginalized groups that we felt, just hadn't received enough attention, and particularly in our curriculum. And we felt that these local histories could really shine a light on some of the larger themes that we wanted to explore, both historically, but also in making connections to what young people and all of us are seeing today. And that's really sort of an overview. We had actually four workshops that we put together. The three that you see here in this flyer were all from last year. And we're happy that we're going to be able to continue this set of offerings into the future as well. And so now we'd like to kind of get into a little bit deeper about sort of the impetus and the catalyst for this program, which really is all about the students.
So imagine,
Mr. Sheehy.
imagine during the summer of 2020, there's all kinds of stuff going on, racial unrest happening after the death of George Floyd. I get an email that says action required. Like, oh, geez, should I open up this email? And in it, a group of former students reached out and basically said that their high school experience didn't prepare them for what they were seeing on their screens, and the issues, the inequalities, the discrimination. They didn't learn about it in as much depth as they expected in their high school classrooms. And they were all in college, going to very prestigious schools, and they had not learned about a lot of these things since or in like high school, and they had an issue with that. So I was like, oh God, what do I do? They expected wholesale changes. So obviously it's tough to go wholesale changes. So one of the things I decided to do is, let's bring everyone together. I mean, we're all sitting at home because we can't go anywhere. Let's have a discussion. Let's get your perspective as alumni. Let's get current students together. Let's get administrators, teachers together. And as a teacher, I want to listen to you. I want to hear your perspective. And we had a couple of roundtable discussions based around what your educational experience was like. And I'm going to kick it over to Eamon and let him give the student perspective on that.
Yeah, so I happen to be one of those current students at the time. I was a junior going into senior year. And I think, as Mr. Sheehy said, we were all very surprised by this outpouring of anger and hate and very strong reactions to George Floyd's death. And I think as we reflected on that, we really came to the conclusion that nothing we had read in our history classes or in our English classes or any courses at the high school had sufficiently taught us what the underlying roots for this anger were. And especially those alumni who contacted Mr. Sheehy pushed this idea that, well, most of our education has taught a very papered over, one-sided perspective of America's past. And we've ignored some of our worst moments, but especially we've ignored the way that a lot of the history of the past carries through to present day. And so because we were missing this connection from, events, Jim Crow and enslavement through the present day, it was hard to see how in the world this anger from the present corresponded to events that happened 100, 200, 300 years ago. And so after that, we eventually pushed Mr. Sheehy to perhaps push for more of a change in the curriculum in the school system, because we thought, well, the best way to do this is through humanities of some sort, teaching history more in depth, teaching a broader style of history, bringing more English curriculum in so that we could teach a broader spectrum of works in order to enable students to get a more wide perspective on the world and understand how exactly we got to where we were in the summer of 2020.
And all of you teachers out there is like, that sounds awesome, but how do you do it? Like, how do you change wholesale curriculum? How do you change teachers' mindsets? And that was a pretty daunting task. And I was challenged by students who I really respected and really like appreciated them reaching out to me as alumni. And I really appreciated the current students, their perspectives in our roundtables. So I kind of internalized it and said, what can I do? And that's where I came up with the idea for this program, to empower teachers to have these discussions and provide them with resources, provide them with the pedagogy knowledge, and to have difficult discussions, and then the content knowledge so that they are quote unquote experts on what they're going to be talking about. And that was kind of the impetus of this program. And we'll continue to get into it, but to kind of just continue the student perspective, I'm going to show a clip of a video on how important students. Now, I got a group of students. I think there's probably 7 or 8 of you students or who contributed to this video, current and former students who, when I told them about this idea to put together a professional development program, they all volunteered and gave up time to kind of make this video to advocate for this program. Because I mean, to do this, it does require getting some funding, which Beth and I will talk about later. But you need to have, like, you need to bring in scholars, you need to do a lot of things. So I was kind of floored by the students kind of giving up their time to help create and advocate for this program. So I'm going to play like a minute or 2 of it. If you need me to mute, let me know.
Hi. In the wake of the death of George Floyd, many people began taking action throughout their communities to draw more attention to the systemic racism and dramatic racial inequalities that exist in the United States of America. A group of current and former North Andover High School students began hosting bi-weekly roundtable discussions related to various topics that were typically neglected from the general school curriculum: the prison industrial complex, redlining, white privilege, and many more. These topics are far more relevant and prevalent today than any of us initially thought. And it begged the question, why didn't we learn about these serious topics when we were in school? Here are some of the group's thoughts.
I think resources like this would be awesome to have as a high schooler, just because although we read a lot about historical figures and contemporary global figures who are overtly racist, we oftentimes don't address the ways that prejudices and biases shape our own communities and the way that we behave on an interpersonal and local level. And I think if we really want to make longstanding social change, we have to all independently really examine our own biases and have those difficult conversations. And I think especially in a place like North Andover, that's not something you can do without looking at how our community and those around us have been shaped by years of racial divides and policies and so forth. So I think that having something like this would have been greatly beneficial to me in high school. It would have helped me confront a lot of biases that I didn't look at till later, until getting to college. And I think that to create a more tolerant, inclusive, respectful, and understanding generation of future students, this is absolutely essential.
I think that this project created by Mr. Shi is a really great idea because it will educate more people within the school about the issue of racism by teaching them about the marginalized groups and the racism faced by them. I think that courses right now in school don't spend enough time covering these topics, which makes it seem as though the problem has been solved or is not as relevant today, even though it is. So I think that by giving more attention to these groups, it'll definitely make people understand the issue more, and it will bring us one step closer toward making some positive change within our community and bringing people together and help solving the problem of division.
Don't want to listen to that again. So yeah, you really get the sense of how important doing something, and I really wanted to create something for the students. So it came up with the idea of teaching hidden histories, and I pitched it to Essex National Heritage, and we got funding. Beth and I could talk about that later, but I think that for a program like this, modeled it after something that as a young teacher I experienced, a program that Essex National Heritage actually put together called Using Essex History, where the model is you provide teachers with local resources and content knowledge. And I think one of the ways to really connect with our students is to make it relevant to them. And when we can convey a lot of the topics that the students were advocating for on the local level, it kind of takes a very deeper kind of resonance, and they appreciate it more, and they want to know more about their local communities. So when you're able to provide teachers with these local resources that talk about topics of discrimination, racism, it's definitely more meaningful for them. So Eamon, you want to, any thoughts from the student perspective?
Yeah, so I think coming from that background of education where it was a very simplified version of racial history, the events that stand out, we talked a lot about the March on Washington, the Civil Rights Movement, Lincoln and the emancipation of slaves, along with the amendments that followed. But those are very abstract because they weren't close to home. You can talk a lot about the March on Washington, and there were, it was a phenomenal speeches were given that day. You can talk about the bus boycott in Montgomery, but they're very far off concepts because they don't hit close to home. But when you talk about like this video on this page here, we discussed these race riots that were happening in Lawrence, which is 5 minutes down the road from here. Or in a few minutes, we're going to talk about Salem Poor, who was an enslaved person who was born about a mile down the road from here. It's incredible because you're making that connection where I can go and say, wow, this happened here. I live right by here. How did I not know that this was happening? And you can feel a sense of connection in the sense that this small event is part of a greater national phenomenon. And it really deepens those ties between historical events and your community. And it made me personally feel like I could see where there were missteps in our history because I could really connect those events to my local community.
So that was the overview of kind of the impetus for the program. So now we'll talk about the structure of it, because there's a lot that went into developing a lot, like all of these sources and bringing people together.
That's right. So as Brian, I think, mentioned, we had been part of this Using Essex History, and we sort of wanted to model this professional development program on that previous program, because both of us had gotten so much out of it. And what we knew is that we really benefited from having some experts, some scholars who could come and talk to us about, their research, their interests, and people who'd have the time to really go deeply into some of these topics. And as history teachers, that is just so beneficial to us to hear from those types of experts. And we knew that the experts themselves, felt that bringing of their knowledge to teachers, to educators, is actually helping them in the sense that it's making their research more relevant. Teachers are such special people in our communities, as Dave was saying. We so appreciate what you all have been doing in COVID especially, but teachers make connections with youth. And so bringing that content expertise out from, colleges and places that, kind of it might tend to stay into teachers' hands and then through them into students, we just felt is so powerful. We also knew, though, that it's not just content, it's not just understanding the history, which is difficult enough to do, especially with these histories that maybe we haven't been taught properly, or we as teachers don't understand as well as we'd like to understand them. But then there's that whole second layer or third or fourth layer of then trying to understand, well, I'm getting this history, I'm getting this under my belt now, but how am I going to teach this? And that also is extremely challenging. So we knew we wanted to bring in folks to help us with that piece of it as well. And community voices, people who are going to help us make the connections that Eamon was talking about in terms of modern day relevance. Who are the activists in our communities today who understand how these histories are connecting to what's going on now? Let's hear from them as well. And we can, kind of learn collaboratively. And then, as Eamon and Brian were saying, the local resources were really key to our sense of how this program would be successful. Bringing in the local aspect really does just kind of make the relevance really, really increase for students. And we've seen that in my position at Essex Heritage. That's really what we try to do, is connect people with these local resources. And we know from years of trying to do this with teachers that students really do respond. And we heard it from Eamon to this idea, like, oh my gosh, that happened like over there, right next to where I live. And it just brings it home in a different way.
And I definitely think for this to be successful, you needed to have all these components together, because teachers, if they don't feel comfortable, and I completely understood the perspective of the students, but I also knew the perspective of a teacher. And being the department coordinator, I knew if I was to walk into my department and say, hey, you need to do this, they'll be like, well, how do I do it? And providing that content knowledge, and then the pedagogy expert on how to do it and how to have difficult conversations, pairing those together, and then providing teachers with the actual sources was kind of like the perfect plan on how to make this a successful program, and to make teachers comfortable in incorporating it, because that's what we want. We don't want teachers to not use this. This is something that we spent a lot of time putting together, and we definitely want people using it. So. And it was really cool to collaborate with people, and I'll let Beth talk about that.
Yeah, just a little bit more about these collaborations. So we mentioned, we went to folks in higher education. We definitely were relying on their expertise. We also went to, and especially Brian, went to our local archives. And because a lot of these repositories have amazing collections. And some of the sources, and Brian can talk more about this, that we put together for the program really hadn't been things that maybe some of these archives even knew existed in their collections. Some of them they did, but there was a lot of almost like new research that was being done in some of these repositories, and of course collaborating with K-12. Each of these different types of institutions, though, has their own cultures too. So having to negotiate between those cultures and trying to understand how to best tap into all of these resources that we could come together collaboratively did take a lot of preparation. So Brian and I had a lot of Zoom meetings with a lot of different people, and we learned so much just in preparing for these sessions. But we feel that, having this collaborative nature of the program really strengthened it so much, because we were hearing from folks who had different backgrounds and could then connect with each other.
I definitely think it with the compiling of sources, I think David said it, really said it earlier, like we're re-examining how we view history, what is out there. And by doing this kind of work, getting into the archives, you're bringing to light new things, or they're really not new, but you're rediscovering things that are lost in these archives and bringing them to teachers, and then those teachers sharing them with their students kind of gives us a much deeper understanding and appreciation for for history. And we're really kind of making those connections. And when we're talking about civic duty in kind of the civics portion of it, what better of a civics program could you have than uncovering in kind of re-examining our local history and providing our students with sources that are from the local level, and maybe challenge some of the things that we have assumed about our local history. So
as we were preparing this, we also wanted to be mindful of what the state was guiding us with this type of social studies exploration. And so DESE has done a lot to try to support teachers, particularly with this guiding principle 2 in the frameworks, where they're really asking us to do what the students were asking. We need to incorporate more diverse perspectives. We have to be responsive to the students who are in our classrooms, who are going to be coming from different backgrounds. And it benefits all of us to have these more diverse explorations as we're approaching history. We actually spoke with Ruben Enriquez, who's at DESE, and he helped us a lot in trying to understand how to bring in this guidance that DESE was providing. They actually put together these 3 sort of key terms that we tried to incorporate into the PD, being inclusive, being responsive, being critical. And so we tried to really mirror what we were seeing at the state level and making sure that our program was aligning with what the state was asking us to do and what the students honestly were asking us to do.
And again, when you're trying to create a program and kind of justifying it to teachers, you need to follow a curriculum. Oh, I can't do that. Well, you have to, because it's in the curriculum. So that was an important piece of including this kind of stuff.
So these were some of the key questions that we came up with, and we realized that they did align kind of beautifully with how the state was also helping us think about being more inclusive, critical, and responsive. So we just wanted to share these questions that we had that were sort of at the heart of the program. Particularly, we want to help students connect with this history. And we want to keep their voices and ideas at the forefront of our teaching. That was something that we felt was really important. And Eamon and his, some of the other students at North Andover really did help us with that. With each of these sessions that we held with educators, we tried to have student voice, a piece of that. And Brian and his students really helped us with that piece.
We'll get to that in a sec. So yeah, now into the 4 sessions. The first one was very Lawrence based, being a person who grew up in Greater Lawrence. I really kind of resonated towards the topic of the long journey, Irish and modern day Latinx immigration in the Merrimack Valley, and kind of comparing and contrasting some of the similarities and like some of the differences between both of those experiences. I think a lot of times in our history classrooms, we only talk about immigration that happened in the 19th century or early 20th century, and we don't kind of bring it to modern day and kind of telling that story and breaking down some of the stereotypes, and that was really important. The second one, we looked at the struggle for liberty, equality, property, examining resistance to exclusionary policies against Black people in Essex County. That one was definitely more 18th, early 19th century. We're hoping to actually run another one in this coming March on more of the 19th and 20th century experience. But it kind of, just to sidetrack a little bit, but it requires a lot of digging. You know, a lot of this history isn't just right there. So I've had to spend a lot of time hanging out in archives and in searching through different databases and things like that to come up with this stuff. But I think it's really relevant and it's really useful for students to get that kind of stuff. The third one that we did was on Indigenous people, an acknowledgement and recognition of Native peoples in our region, past and present. And that one was really interesting, connecting with some of the Indigenous people in the area and kind of telling that story. I've done a lot in my classroom this year with a lot of those materials, and it's really, students are their eyes are open to, wow, we've never talked about this stuff before. I never knew that. And I think that that's part of kind of the beauty of giving our students these type of resources. You know, it really kind of resonates with them. And then the fourth one that we did this past November was the Lawrence Strike of 1919 and the push to Americanize the workforce. Great resources on that one. There was a lot of Americanization, actually there was some really interesting civics education stuff that came up, and what it means to be an American, and in your classrooms, these are the things that should be taught, and in kind of focusing on immigrant families, and there was some really interesting pieces to that. So if you're looking at some of that, some of the resources from that session were really interesting. Beth, anything else you want to add on the structure?
No, I think those are good summaries.
Mr.
Eamon,
Sheehy,
you
if I
wanna-
could just add something very quickly. Yeah, I think you mentioned that the difficulty of not everything just being right in front of your face and having to go dig. And I think that was a big part of what we were pushing people like you, Mr. Sheehy, and other educators to do, was not to follow this cookie cutter model of what teaching history was, but to go forward and do the dirty work to figure out how you could change the curriculum and make it something more unique, but something that was actually going to resonate with us better. And these hidden history workshops did a brilliant job of that, I think.
And just to retort that a little bit, I'm going to turn it back on him, and I'm going to show everybody the ways in which I made students do some work too, and not just have me uncover all these sources. I made them do something with it. You know,
That is true.
it is. So this first workshop, like Beth said earlier, we tried to like bring in student voice. One of the things that we wanted to do was model how, I mean, for this first session, I think there's like 150 sources. There's so many sources that I pulled for this first session, and wanted to show how you could use these sources in your classroom and model it. So I got, there were probably like eight or nine of us, right, Eamon?
Yeah, that sounds right.
Got them together, and like he mentioned earlier, we did some comparing and contrasting, and we looked at the Lawrence riots in 1984, and we looked at a riot that happened, it was 1854 or something like that, with involving the Irish, and that, and kind of comparing and contrasting some of the terminology, different things like that. Looked at a couple of other sources, looking at culture and kind of comparing and contrasting some of the similarities in culture, and kind of modeling how to interpret and how to break down the sources, and kind of guiding students through the process of how you would analyze and break down sources. Any thoughts, Eamon?
Yeah, I mean, they were very valuable because I don't think it was too taxing on any of us, very base level historical source analysis, but it was interesting because they were conversations that we didn't typically have. But seeing these two headlines, 130 years apart, was very interesting because of how similar the two riots were discussed. Back to you, Mr. Sheehy.
And if I remember correctly, we also then kind of brought it to modern day and some of the things that were happening modern day. And that was kind of the interesting piece of having these discussions and kind of allowing that to happen, and kind of trusting that students can have these kind of discussions and meaningful discussions I think was an important piece. And one of the things that I wanted to convey in creating this is, if you develop the right kind of scenario with your students, you can have difficult discussions if you set parameters. Beth, you want to talk about workshop
Sure.
2?
As Brian mentioned, we put together all these sources. Brian did an amazing job compiling just numbers and numbers of sources. At the second workshop, which was exploring Black experience in Essex County, there was this really incredible source that a lot of teachers ended up using. I should say, we had opportunities for teachers to earn PDPs. We're PDP providers. We also, because we've gotten funding from the National Park Foundation, we had a little bit of money to offer as stipends as well. So some teachers were able to put together lesson ideas. And also we were able to have them come back as a smaller cohort to talk about things that they had tried out with students and share a little bit about that, which was really, I think, really helpful. Again, when we're trying out new things, and especially things that maybe, you know, might mean that we're going to have discussions that might have some challenges, it's so nice to have that feeling of support where other educators are trying it as well. And what did you do? And how did it go? And those types of conversations were really important. And that's what we were able to facilitate. But anyway, this particular source was used by a lot of the educators who submitted for PDPs. And it's this source actually reprints the Declaration of Independence. It was first published in July of 1776. And so that first page of the newspaper in Salem is reprinting the Declaration, but then the second page has runaway enslaved people ads, as you can see here. And there's also other mentions of how slavery was existing in this time. So you can imagine the juxtaposition of the Declaration with these other pieces in the paper presented such opportunities for teachers to think about how they might have students interpret what is going on here. And so this is just a little example of what one teacher did to have her students explore some of the, you know, what was in these in this source. I think that, you know, again, using these local sources, the teachers who came back and talked to us about what happened after they tried stuff out with the students, they kept saying how the fact that it was local just almost like woke the students up in a different way and really had them be more interested in trying to interpret history, which, you know, isn't always maybe the most exciting thing to do, but it felt exciting and it felt important because of the way that it was so local and how they could, you know, make these connections to maybe what was happening today.
I definitely think when you show things like this to your students, and you can put Beverly, you can put Andover, you can put any town or city that was around in 1770s out there, and you'll see these kind of things. And when students see that, they're like, oh, what, like, I think it just brings to the forefront that this happened everywhere. You know, the institution of slavery isn't something that happened just in the South. It was here too. And we have to kind of talk about that, and you have to know about that. And yeah, I think it's important for students to see that. So here's the Civic Action Project. So Eamon, who told me I should do all this research, well, I compiled a bunch of research and I said, hey, Eamon, do something with it. So I'll let Eamon talk about the like the example of a civic action project.
Yeah, so I mean, that is pretty much how it went. He shoved a bunch of sources at me and said, go nuts. And so this enslaved person, Salem Poor, has a very interesting backstory. And Mr. Sheehy, if you don't know his backstory, I'll give you the brief version of his life, which is that he was born in the mid 18th century in Andover. He was baptized at the North Parish Church, which is like 5 minutes down the road from here. Very, very cool. He eventually earned his freedom by purchasing his way out, which is something very rare in the 18th century. Later, he married his wife and then settled down in Andover before enlisting in a local militia, where he was named a hero for fighting off and killing many British soldiers at the Battle of Bunker Hill, which is his big claim to fame because he was commended for it by the Massachusetts General Court. Now, the thing that struck me as very significant about this example is that Salem Poor is a local hero because obviously his commendation, but also the fact that he overcame such great odds and adversity to become someone who was admired in the eyes of the Massachusetts General Court. And yet I had never heard of him until Mr. Sheehy gave me these sources to create this video. But his story also touches on the fact that enslavement was very prevalent in the North and especially in New England, when it's something we will often ignore or push the blame onto the South because it's easier than reckoning with our own past. But this project was very cool because I got to have hands-on experience. I got to work with the Massachusetts Historical Society, which was a very cool experience. And it was an eye-opening opportunity because it was something that was my project where I got to learn about it through my own work, and that made it that much more rewarding, but also something that has stuck with me for much longer than if it were just here's this page, read it, and that's it. So it was very worthwhile, Mr. Sheehy.
I also want to say, like, the fact that Eamon did this project, yes, he did it for his own benefit, for, like for Mr. Sheehy, but it was also extremely important in a larger sense because it helped us bring awareness for teachers to understand the Salem Poor story. So it was actually for a larger purpose, which I think if we're considering civic action projects, something like this, is so beneficial for all of us in the community, because what Eamon did is helping all of us understand this history better.
Yeah, it's definitely something that could be emulated a billion times over. There's so many other stories out there. There's hidden histories everywhere, and I think that empowering our students to kind of bring those to light can be really meaningful, and it's something, again, we're going to have to do in our classrooms, so there's definitely other opportunities for this kind of work, and this is a very good. Amy did a great job on this, I will say that.
Thank you.
We have it in the resource page for you if you'd like to view it, which you of course should. So we're going to kind of wrap up by saying that we did see some really wonderful impacts with this series. Many people, kind of, the educators who are involved talked about how appreciative they were. We know that students have benefited from it. And like we said, even the presenters really found it to be worthwhile. This idea of collaboration, coming together, supporting each other in something that we know is really hard to do on our own, I think were some of our takeaways. We really do feel like this could be replicated in other places. We'd be happy to talk with anyone more in depth about how we went through it. We'd love to see more of these types of workshops in other parts of Massachusetts and beyond.
Yeah, this has been an amazing experience for me to be able to kind of put something together that the students really advocated for is why you become a teacher in that. So happy to help in any way in doing it in other places or assisting people. Eamon, any thoughts from the student perspective?
I am incredibly grateful that you and Beth worked so hard to put this together, because it's you responded to us and you listened and you didn't just brush us off, and for that you are amazing.
Wouldn't go that far.
You are amazing, Brian. We all recognize that. So I just want to thank all three of you for your presentation just now and for sharing all your work together. Looks like you've really gained a new friendship along with a lot of the work that you put in together and all that you've achieved for North Andover and for Essex County particularly. I do wonder if the three of you want to talk just briefly a little bit more about how, do you have any pointers for teachers who might be from other parts of the state, other counties, about how to get involved in this, how to get this ball rolling in their own areas? Because they're obviously going to be dealing with some different history, but might be interested in doing a similar kind of work in their area.
I think the first step is to just reach out to different historical societies in your area, and see what they have. I mean, I was actually talking to my buddy from Long Island who wants to do something like this, but they don't have anything down there. So we are kind of lucky in this area that we have a lot of resources. But that would be step number one, just to see what is out there. Do some Google searches. A lot of the towns and cities have town histories that were written in the 19th century. And one of the things we didn't talk about is how those can be analyzed and broken down and reassessed, because the way that those 19th century histories are written, extremely racist, extremely just not how they would be written today. And I think that that's something that you could examine in your classroom. So there's a variety of different things that you could do. Beth, what do you think?
I mean, as someone who works closely with a lot of these historical societies, museums, and so forth, many of them really would love to work with teachers. And so I think that, just like Brian said, trying to reach out, sometimes you just have to like get the right person or get them at the right time. They might not always be open all season. Sometimes that's the case. But if you can make a connection, you don't have to have hundreds of sources even. You could have a few key, really interesting sources and come up with a really relevant, interesting project for students. So, I think it's just making the ask. And a lot of times people are going to be responsive. Brian's also just like a whiz at following through though. Like he'll get a lead somewhere and then he'll go someplace else and he kind of follows it through. Some of this stuff is digitized, right, Brian?
Yeah, like ancestry.com. You can get a lot of census records. I was actually going through some census records last week, trying to go, like Beth said, trying to go down that rabbit hole for a person of color who lived in Haverhill. And I was trying to get his story and kind of figure out where he was from and all of that. But a lot of stuff is digitized. Newspapers are digitized, so you can get a perspective. I mean, I think with all of the sources that you find, you have to look at them through the lens of when they're written, who they're written for, and all of that. But again, those are all things that as history teachers, we want our students to do as well. So.
And students might catch the bug and want to, continue some of this research as long as, you get somebody like Eamon in your class. I mean, your work is done. You just say, go for it. So I think they're inherently interesting, these topics.
Absolutely.
So we have just a couple of minutes left here. I am wondering if any of our audience have any questions for our presenters today. Feel free to unmute yourself and speak up.
I already did. Can you hear me? Hello?
Yes.
Can you hear me?
We can hear you faintly.
Okay, so can you hear me now?
Yes.
Now we
Okay.
can.
This is Vince Dixon. I'm a local historian, live in Winchester, lived for many years in Boston and Cambridge. And a couple of points that I thought were useful, I wanted to put up things that happened from about 1990.
Vince,
Postmodern
we're having a
era.
hard time hearing you.
Okay, try that again. That a little better?
Yeah.
Okay. I'm in Winchester, Vince Dixon, a historian. I grew up in Boston and Cambridge. From 1990, it is generally conceded or thought to be the beginning of the postmodern era. And this is an important point, often not understood. The word modern originally was an ideology. It's become a bit generic, but modernism itself emphasized ignoring the past. And Soviet modern man, communism, the Nazi, New German Reich specifically embraced modernism, and eventually it filtered into the Atlantic community. And this has been a problem because people then have simply ignored the world from about 1945 backward. And to re-engage means to be open to all of the previous historical events and their problems. And I just thought it was a useful point to make that modernism itself was an ideology that creates some of the barriers to even looking at previous history over the last 40 years or so.
Vince, thank you for your comment. It's very helpful.
Yeah, and I think a lot of what we found too, or, and other researchers, historians, many people know this, but I think it warrants just mentioning that, a lot of these archives or historical societies, museums, did not value these histories. And that's why they maybe even erased some of these histories or just didn't pay attention to them, or, they just didn't intentionally collect these histories. So that is definitely a challenge. But it doesn't mean that we cannot do something. We definitely can.
That's you add to my point, and I can add one other bit, that public records of property transactions, of building permits, of other public actions exist in vast quantities, and few people think of them as sources for historical research as well. And some of those archives never have been computerized, are at risk of being destroyed because they aren't needed for current transactions. It's another set of historical materials that's very much at risk and very valuable in looking back at the history of the last 100 years in particular.
Vince, again, thank you for your comment. And clearly you have your own expertise to offer here. So I hope folks in Winchester in that area can tap into your expertise somewhat further there.
And thank you for the title of Hidden Histories. That's to inspire people to be curious in an area they might not have been.
Exactly the point. So we are at time here, so we're going to need to wrap up. I do want to thank you, Beth, Brian, and Eamon for joining us. I'll just point out that Eamon is first semester in college and is trying to eke out the remaining hours of vacation here. So we really appreciate your taking your time this afternoon, Eamon, for joining us and for giving your student perspective on this. I think it's particularly valuable to hear from you. So thank you for that.
Thank you.
I want to just add too that, on a personal note, thinking back to my own experience in school, doing some local history in 5th grade, I think is really what got me interested in history in the first place. And so some of this can be applied not only in the high school grades, but in the much lower grades in elementary and middle school as well. So I do hope we're keeping an open mind about that and how it can be applied across the grades.
Can I ask a question very quickly before you guys wrap up? My name is Eva Hughes.
Sure, Eva, but we're going to have to make it very quick.
Sure. My question is actually directly for Brian. I teach history at Wayland High School, and I have for some time. And I really appreciate the connection that you're making with local history and students. I find that in particular, that's what kind of pulls them in to being interested in history generally. And the connection to civics, I think, is very, very clear. But my question for you is, did you provide in your resource sheet like a process? So I mean, you kind of threw out some sources out there, and I've seen this kind of work done very, very well, even in my own district. However, where I think a lot of teachers get tripped up is in the process, and that is, where do we start? We can find the sources, and then kind of where do we go from there? So if you could just kind of, I'm not sure that's a question that you can answer quickly. That's kind of what I'm driving and looking for.
I'll try. People have asked that. This is what I have done. I think probably one of the next steps that we should think about is putting together a guidebook on, if you wanted to do this work, these are the step-by-step things that you could do. It doesn't exist yet. It might exist at some point though.
We do actually, so we should say we have websites and they're on the resource sheet. We compiled the sources on the websites, but we also do have some example sort of lessons and also techniques that you might want to try. But the techniques are fairly general. And the lessons, though, do get to kind of like specifics of how you might use X, Y, or Z source. So there's something there, but it's not a lot. Mostly it's like the raw sources.
David, thank you for your question. Appreciate it. So we are going to wrap up here. I have included a couple of additional links in the chat here. If you would please take a moment and fill out our evaluation. It's a very quick evaluation, but we certainly value your feedback to get feedback and input on future sessions like this. We also have information there about how to access future webinars like this one. You see the two that are coming up on February 16th and April 6th that are loaded on the slide here. In addition, the Massachusetts Civic Learning Coalition has a Civic Learning Week that's coming up on March 7th through 11th, first week of March. So we'll hope that some of you can join us for that. And again, there's information about how to stay up to date on what's happening with that at the link that's indicated in the link I just shared in the chat there. So we are going to wrap up here. I do want to thank Beth, Brian, and Eamon once again, and really, thank you for sharing your expertise, and really thank you for your courage and commitment to teaching history in a more complete way and helping students today to come to a deeper understanding of our history. It's so important, as we know from our current day and from some recent events and whatnot. So super important to do this, and you folks are really some of the pioneers in making this work happen and really making it happen in a very concrete way. So thank you again for sharing your expertise this afternoon and for all the work that you have underway still.
Thank you.
We will look forward to seeing you folks, all of you, including our audience today, at future webinars. And again, appreciate your time this afternoon for joining us. Have a good night and Happy New Year.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.